It was a day when mothers fell down crying uncontrollably in the street. And a voice is heard in Rama, or is it Gaza? Weeping in terrible mourning, Rachel or Fatima, weeping for her husband, her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And after the dust had settled and the mob has departed, only the taste of bitterness and hatred remained among all those broken bodies. Fathers hold their dear dead sons in their arms and look to heaven and swear on their lives that they will never forget and never forgive. They will seek their vengeance. They curse the lives of their enemies. Who am I talking about? When am I talking about? Does it matter? This is what human beings do to each other, often in the name of God, often because they are protecting themselves. We come now to the last of our studies in the book of Esther, and in many ways this is the hardest to hear. For I think it speaks to each of us about our own natural instincts and our own behavioural reflexes when we feel unsafe or threatened or disrespected. We see in Esther writ large what we see in the playground writ small, and in every international conflict on the world stage. A cycle of mistrust and intolerance and aggression that cascades down through generations and pollutes communities again and again and again. And the question that I want to ask this morning is there a better way? Is there a way to break the cycle, to live in peace, to heal the wounds? I want to talk this morning about the seeds of mistrust, the plant of intolerance, and the fruit of aggression that blights all our lives. The seed of mistrust, the plant of intolerance, the fruit of aggression, and how to break its hold over us. You may remember that Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. In fact, the voice of God is entirely missing. There is no prophet, there's no angel, there's no commentary about what God is thinking as this story of misery unfolds. There is no inner dialogue to help us to interpret it. It doesn't say this person was obedient to God and God blessed them, or this person was disobedient to God and got themselves into trouble. But we do get clues. Esther chapter 9 verse 6, for example, tells us they did what they pleased with those who hated them. Do you see that? They did what they pleased, not they did what was right to those who hated them, and certainly not they prayed to show mercy and grace to those who hated them, but simply they did as they pleased. And what they pleased was to kill 75,000 people in a 2-day mob lynching, and then throw a party to celebrate it as if they had done something clever. How did it all start? Why did they think that this is a right way to act, to kill so many people? Well, it begins, as it always does, with mistrust. The book of Esther is set about 475 BC in Persia, and many Jews have already returned home from their exile in Babylon, where they were taken to slavery, but they left a sizable community as Persian citizens. And Persia that took over from the Median Empire is now a melting pot of different cultures and religions, and you can imagine all the tensions that might be amongst them. And so in chapter 2, a Persian official named Haman is honoured by the king Xerxes to be vizier. And the king orders everyone to show respect. But a man called Mordecai refuses to do so. So in Esther chapter 3 verse 2, all the royal officials and the king gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honour, for he told them he was a Jew. So Mordecai believed that because he was a Jew, he had a mandate from God to say, I am not like you. I do not respect you. I will not fit in with your laws. So Mordecai does what he thinks is right. Of course he does. And if you ask him, I think Mordecai would give you very many convincing reasons for his mistrust of the Persians. He was different, he was a Jew. And maybe he felt that his Jewish culture was being squeezed by the secular culture of the time, and he needed to make a stand about who he was and what he stood for. And he probably resented how his people had been enslaved by Haman's ancestors all those years ago. Slave history for the Jews. So he did what he thought was right. He showed mistrust. And in that small action, the seed of enmity is sown. You and me, all our quarrels, all our disagreements, all wars start this way. Tiny seeds of mistrust, founded arguably, people will say, for all sorts of very, very, very good reasons. So evil begins as a tiny seed of mistrust, and then it grows into a plant of intolerance. For Haman saw Mordecai's mistrust of him, and he reacted to it. Of course he does. You can't treat people with suspicion and expect them not to react. And so Haman also did what he thought was right, for the good of the empire, of course, and nothing to do with the slight that he felt. So he took Mordecai's reaction and said, I see your mistrust, and I raise you in tolerance. Chapter 3, verse 8. He goes to the king. He says, there's a certain people dispersed and scattered amongst our peoples, whose customs are different from all other people, who do not obey the king's law. And it's not in the king's best interests to tolerate them. Do you see what he does? He says there is a certain people, an unnamed people, those immigrants. We don't trust those immigrants, do we? They're not like us, are they? They have different customs and cultures to us, don't they? And he creates a classic them and us situation. He says they don't keep our laws. Gypsies, tramps and thieves. We hear it from the people of the town they call us. Gypsies, tramps and thieves. We are better off without them. And so the seed of mistrust grows into the plant of intolerance. Sound familiar? You might think I'm talking about an article from News of the World taken just a couple of years ago. But I'm talking about something that happened 2,500 years ago. Which means we pretty much have not learned anything as a civilization. And the human heart is no more kind, and no more gracious, and no more sophisticated than it ever has been. Our fallen attitudes are as old as the hills. You treat me badly, I mistrust you. I mistrust you, you mistrust me. We mistrust each other, we are better off without each other. And soon, therefore, the plant of intolerance yields fruit of aggression. Chapter 3, verse 9, Haman says, if it pleases the king, what do you please to do with this? Let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I'll put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury. And the king said to Haman, do with the people as you please. There it is again, for the third time. Do as you please. Do what you think is right. Kill and destroy them. Get rid of them for all I care. And then the rest of Esther, chapters 3 to 7 happens, which we've just been doing the last 4 or 5 weeks. But we return to chapter 8, chapter 9, the tables have turned. And now the king creates a law allowing every Jewish person the right to protect themselves. Wow, for goodness that. Wow, you might think we can breathe a sigh of relief, because the Jews now have the right to self-defense. They are safe now. Peace is possible now. But the Jews, having been threatened by aggression by Haman, and even though that threat has now been removed by royal decree, they get their retaliation in first. They decide they're going to teach their enemies a lesson. So they do what they please, and they do what they think is right. And what they think is right is chapter 9, verse 2. The Jews assembled in their cities to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them and joined with them. So, driven by fear of aggression, they attack first. Isn't that exactly Russia's justification for invading the Ukraine? NATO was building up on our borders. We didn't trust you. You were moving your military in. Ukraine was moving more and more towards the west. You were even thinking of joining NATO, so we will get our retaliation in first. They attack in the name of self-defense, and others join in with them because they're afraid of them. Isn't that exactly what happened in the Second World War, when people joined in with the Nazis because they were afraid of the Nazis? And verse 5, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. There it is again. They did what they pleased. They did what they thought was right. And so 75,000 people are killed by a Jewish mob and their henchmen. And afterwards they celebrate a job well done, and they enshrine this way of thinking in their culture. In the latest conflict, 1,500 Israelis have been killed or injured by Hamas. That is a terrible evil. 100,000 Palestinians have been killed or injured by Israel. 100,000. You kill or maim 1,500 of us, we're going to kill or maim 100,000 of you. This is what you get when you mess with us. We will teach you not to mess with us ever again. But I want to say, this mentality doesn't work. The father who nurses his dead son or his dying wife is not going to look to heaven and say, let's work for peace. Do you remember how all of this began? It began with one man called Mordecai mistrusting another because he felt justified in doing so. And so this story is a story of the seed of mistrust, the plant of intolerance, the fruit of aggression. And it is the story of every human conflict, whether over state borders or garden fences. And as long as we humans do what we think is right, the story will never change. So the key for us is, no matter how justified we might think we are, we need to stop doing what we think is right and start doing what Jesus says is better. We have to stop behaving like fallen human beings and start thinking like children of God. And God says, meet self-interest then with your interest in them. Meet their distrust with your kindness. Meet their intolerance with your patience. Meet their aggression with your forgiveness. And we human beings say, that is madness. That is liable to get yourself crucified by them. And God says, yes, I know. And we say, it doesn't work. And God says, it worked for you, didn't it? Isn't that what communion is all about? We eat and drink and consume the God who turned the other cheek and forgave when we crucified him. The power to meet rejection with embrace, suspicion with kindness, and even hate with love is actually something we have all experienced in this room. It's something we taste and see in communion. This is how God treats us. Oh my. He came into a world that rejected him. He loved a world that is suspicious of him. He forgave a world that crucified him. Because the only way God knows to change a human heart is through love and sacrifice. The only way to make enemies friends is to work to redeem them, to show grace, to think grace, to act graciously. It is to value the other, to risk the slap, to work to redeem. We will always naturally, you and me, want to work for our own self-interests. We will always feel justified in treating others in the way we think they deserve. But that isn't the point, is it? to treat people as they deserve. We don't want to give people what they deserve because God did not give us what we deserved. We know that God demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, he loved us. He died for us. We have to involve God in our attitudes, in our lives, in the way we approach people that we are suspicious of. Otherwise, nothing will change. Not between nations, not between people, not between you and me, not between you and your neighbour. We have to stop doing what we think is right and start doing what Jesus showed is better. Because Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for following God, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And if only the Persians and the Palestinians and the Russians